Okay, the task I've given myself is to do a digital painting of Admiral Nelson using this as reference of lighting and likeness, and inspired in some way by this fused glass painting. The kind of crazy brushstrokes, crazy color. I like it. I want to give this old guy new energy, right? So how can we do that? Well, I'm going to close them out of preview. In fact, I don't even want to have preview open. The only program I want to have open is Photoshop, because this digital painting takes quite a load. And I'm going to open both of those images, both of my inspirations, with Photoshop. And if I am commissioned to do a digital painting, I want more than just one photo reference, right? The more you have, the better. But then I'll also have my inspirations. So here I've got Admiral Nelson. Here I've got the digital, or the fused glass inspiration from Tim Carey. Now I need to set up my file. This is going to be all my own pixels. So I say File, New. And because I'm creating everything digitally with my stylus, I don't want to make it a small resolution, right? So I am going to go to at least 11 by 14. And because I'm doing a portrait, I'm going to do 11 inches wide. So remember, that's inches, not pixels. By 14 inches tall. And then using our standard lab resolution, 350 pixels per inch. Now this allows me, if I really like how this turns out, it allows me to print up to 16 by 20 inches and still have at least 240 pixels per inch. And of course, it allows me to do anything smaller than that. So it's kind of perfect for our lab. 11 by 14 at 350 pixels per inch. Now I'm going to move that blank white canvas to the front of my browser tabs, or not, my Photoshop tabs, and then I'm going to set it up so that I can see my reference in Photoshop while I am doing my painting. And to do that, I go to Window, Arrange, and I'm going to say 3 upstacked. This is what I almost always use. I used this when I was doing digital coloring as well. Then you can arrange it a little bit. You can shrink your references a little bit. I actually want to move this one down and move Admiral Nelson up. So now I'm going to do it again, arrange 3 upstacked. So that, because I'm right-handed, so it's good for me to have my dominant reference in the upper right-hand corner, kind of like you see with the navigator. It's also very helpful to have a navigator open for digital painting. And one way you can do that is go to your workspace, and you can try the painting setup and then just switch from swatches to navigator. Right. But it's also nice to see your layers. You can have your brushes. So I just have mine as my, my default. So I have Admiral Nelson up here. I'm going to shrink that down to fit in the space. So Command minus. Same thing with my stylistic reference here. And now I have my painting surface. I have my rulers turned on. What's something I can do? Well, one thing I can do is I can immediately just start sketching. Some of you are going to want to do this. It depends how much you want a true likeness. So I will always leave my background solid white, just like with digital coloring. So I'm going to make a new background, a new layer. I'm going to lock the background layer entirely. And then go to layer 1, and this is going to be my base sketch. Right. And then for my base sketch, instead of just using a standard brush, which looks very digital, I'm going to make a brush. So let me show you how you do that. I'm going to say File, New, because I don't need my brush to be 11 by 14 inches by 350 pixels per inch. And I'm just going to do 1000 by 1000 pixels. This is kind of the most basic brush. Doesn't matter the orientation. And then I am just going to, with default black on white at 100% opacity, with any brush you like, any texture you like. I just have a standard pressure sensitive brush. I'm going to make a bunch of marks. This is where you get to choose the texture of your strokes, if they're rough or if they're smooth. I am imitating kind of a hog's hair bristle brush. with a lot of space in between the marks. Because that's actually how this was painted. Notice I'm just using solid black at 100%, but I'm varying the shapes and the directions. And I tend to make my brushes at a 45-degree tilt. So this is a brush that's not round. This is kind of a flat brush. You'll see what I mean. Once you like it, it can have little stripes in it. You know, it can be as funky as you want, but you're going to see this is just the beginning of customizing a brush. I could even go in and erase it a little bit. So with a 100% eraser, hard-edged, not nearly as big, I could go in and kind of cut away. But you want to design your brush with just blacks and solid blacks and solid white on 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. Then I could go back in and paint a little more. All right, so I've got this pretty customized looking brush. Now how do I turn it into a brush? I go to Edit, and I say Define Brush Preset. I click that. I'm going to name it with my name, Karl SP19 Brush. And I tend to use the same brush throughout digital painting, but you can create several custom brushes. Now, that brush is in my brush options at the very bottom. So here's Karl's SP19 brush. Now I can close this. I don't need it anymore. Don't save. Now if I use that brush, this is what it does. Now that looks different, but it still looks very digital, right? That's because it's always locked at the same angle. That's not how I would really use that brush. So now we go to the brush settings. And you can find them in your tools here. It's brush settings, and if you don't see it, you can see it under Window, brush settings. So select your custom brush, and then the most important one to customize is your shape dynamics. This is basically how you hold your brush. And the most important one for me is to control the size of your brush based on the pen pressure of your tablet. So that when you touch lightly, it is small, and when you press harder, it is bigger. But you see how it's still all locked at the same angle? That looks very artificial. So the next thing I'm going to do is play with the angle jitter and set it to shift a little bit. The control doesn't actually matter because I don't have a fancy enough tablet. You get into higher end tablets, you can set the angle based on your tablet. And then the roundness, I can play with that, which will kind of soften out some of the edges. And I can also play with the minimum diameter, though it doesn't make sense to make that too large. And now between all of those, I have a brush that I can start experimenting with that starts to look more like an analog tool, right? Right now it's kind of sharp and it looks a little bit like charcoal. But you won't see the same pattern repeat in it, right? Okay, so that's a pretty good start. That looks more like a tool I can use. Other things I can play with. I can play with scattering, and I can decide to break it up a little bit more at the edges, right? Especially if I'm doing some like quick coverage of shapes, scattering can help. I can even make it basically an airbrush and like really scatter it, right? So if I want full coverage. And all of that texture is just customized. And then I can always turn these things off. So those are just the basic things, and then you can play with other things as we get into color. So I'm just going to play with shape dynamics. That's it. Okay, now I'm on layer 1. I'm on my base paint layer. What can I do now that I have a brush? It's at 100% opacity. It's really large. I'm going to take it down to be a little bit smaller. Well, I'm going to take its opacity down a little bit, maybe to about 70. And then I'm going to stay on the brush the entire time I'm digitally painting, but I'm going to hold down Option to get colors from my palette. When you hold down Option, you get the eyedropper tool. And if you have images open in Photoshop, you can just steal colors directly from them. So I can find the local color of his face, and then I can just kind of paint in his face very quickly with my custom brush. And notice it's not all one flat color because I'm only painting at 70% opacity. Then I can put in kind of a local color for his hair. This is a very loose kind of speed painting way to do it, but it works well. It's kind of like using Procreate on an iPad. And I can find the highlights of his skin and even paint that in. So immediately I can go from flat color to duotone, even to full spectrum if I find like kind of the red shadows under his nose, right? I'm using a big chunky brush really early. The pinks of his cheek. Right? And then I can do the same thing with the other colors. Notice how I'm just stealing them directly. And I am not drawing him first. I'm not even sketching him first. I am just putting in big shapes. And if I need more canvas, I can always grow my canvas, but it's at minimum, it will be 11 by 14 at 350 pixels per inch. Now, this is the best way I've found to actually have a lot of your own personality in your painting, right? But sometimes we don't like our own personality, especially if we're new to this, and we just want it to look like the photograph or the reference. And I can see I've already gotten a lot of things wrong, so I just start expanding his head a little bit, and I fix it just with the paint, just like I would with oil painting or with a base acrylic. And before too long, you see how all that blank white on the bottom is kind of oppressive? It makes everything look kind of darker than it really is. So before too long, once I've painted in some lighter tones, like the highlights on his nose and on his chin and on his cheek, then I'm going to go to my background and I'm going to duplicate my white background and I'm going to fill it with middle gray. Because that's a toned surface, which allows you then to paint in with highlights. Whoops, I don't want to paint on middle gray. I'm going to lock that as well. And then at 70%, I can start painting in these little highlights, and they'll blend with the colors underneath. And I'm not going to get too detailed too early. So this is just really quick speed painting, big chunky brushes, establishing a darkest dark pretty early. Not trying to do the details. Like if I try to do his eyebrow with this size brush, you know, it's going to be kind of laughable. If I try to do his eyes without zooming in, it's going to be a little laughable. But it will have personality. I'm going to steal, with Option, steal his lip color. I'm going to paint that in. Steal more of his hair. Some of the shadow tones.
Can you keep his eyes like that?
It would be fun. Now, for whatever reason, when it comes to painting, all of us seize up. You know, we treat it like it's more important than drawing or sketching. But with digital art, you're not wasting money on canvas. It is, it's just sketching, but sketching with shape and color. And it's very important, even if you want a photorealistic finish, not to start zooming in and get too oriented in detail too early. So it's nice to have kind of this big brush, not zooming in yet, right? Not getting into the nitty-gritty details, because it forces me to simplify and get these big shapes down. Now I'll show you